Right, today we are going to talk about the movement of small gut, right? Movement of small intestine. Small intestine. Small, you know that small intestine consists of three parts. Yes, what are those three parts? Yes, yes, you start with the duodenum, and then there is, yes, jejunum, and then we have ileum. Is that right? And ileum terminate at cecum. Now, here we have duodenum from here up to here. Here is jejunum. About 5% of small intestine is, what is this? Duodenum. About 45% is, or yes, 40% is jejunum, and about 55% is ileum. Right? Now we are going to talk about the movements. First of all, what is the purpose of small intestine? The major purpose of small intestine is digestion and absorption, right? So it means the movement which are going to be there in the small intestine, they must serve and help in digestion and absorption. And the motility in small intestine, what it is doing there, the movement in small intestine, number one, it moves the content, right? It moves the content throughout, and for movement purpose, of course, the movement generated a propulsive movement, which are peristalsis. Secondly, not only we need to move the content through the small intestine, but we also need to mix the content of small intestine. We need to mix the contents of small intestine, right? With what? With the gastrointestinal secretions. Because in small intestine, of course, from here, right, there are biliary secretions from gallbladder coming, and the pancreatic secretions, right? Small intestine is receiving the bile, it is also receiving the pancreatic juices, it is also receiving the intestinal secretions from the mucosa of the small gut, which is called succus entericus. So it is receiving bile, it is receiving pancreatic juices, and it is from its own wall, there are glands which are secreting small intestinal secretions, or which are called succus entericus. So all bile and pancreatic juices and succus entericus needs to be mixed with the content of small intestine, needs to be mixed thoroughly with the chyme so that digestion can be done well. Is that right? And another purpose of small intestinal movement is, of course, not only to move the content, not only to mix the content with the secretions, but there's one more purpose. Yes, what is that purpose? Just imagine. What could be the third purpose? One is very clear, movement of the, you are moving the content through peristaltic movement, right? Then you are mixing the content with the segmentational movement, or we'll talk about mixing movement. Do you think there's any other purpose of movements of small intestine? Yeah, they help in absorption, because when the contents of small intestine are churned, is that right? Then more and more areas of the content are exposed to the mucosal wall, so that mucosal wall can absorb the digested material, right? So another is that exposure of the content to the mucosal, yes, wall for better absorption, right? So what's there? That small intestinal movement move the contents, there should be peristaltic movement, and there should be mixing movement to mix the contents or chyme with the secretions, and of course moving the contents and churning the content in such a way that more and more contents of small intestine come in contact with the wall of mucosa, so that there should be absorption of digested material. Is that right? And of course, sometimes small intestinal movement, they become reverse anti-peristalsis, which contribute to the vomiting. Is that right? So they also play a role in vomiting. Now, after knowing this thing, we know that small intestine has two types of muscles. Number one, there is muscularis mucosae in the mucosa, right? And there is muscularis externa, right? First of all, the major movement are not produced by the muscularis mucosae, right? The muscularis layer, which is in the mucosa, it produces only very minor changes in the mucosal lining, right? Major movements are produced by muscularis externa, circular layer and longitudinal layer in muscularis externa, which is a thick layer of muscles. But muscularis mucosae, which is a very thin sheet of muscles, that only produces different kinds of mucosal fold, right? They produce mucosal fold so that they increase the absorption and they increase the surface area for the absorption. Secondly, muscularis mucosae has also its smooth muscles going into the core of the villi, small intestinal villi, and those muscles elongate and shorten the intestinal villi so that intestinal villi protrude deeply into lumen and regress back, and then deeply protrude into lumen and regress back, so that whatever in the lacteals, which are the lymphatic drainage of these villi, lacteals, in the lacteals, whatever fats are there, they are milked and absorbed. So we also call it milking process. So muscularis mucosa has what kind of two activities? Number one, muscularis mucosa, which is controlled by submucosal plexus. Muscularis mucosa is controlled by submucosal plexus, point number one. Secondly, muscularis mucosa produce different kinds of infolding of mucosa in the lumen so that surface area should be increased. Number three, muscularis mucosa is moving the villi, and because it is moving the villi, so it not only repeatedly villi get elongated and then shortened, elongated and then shortened, and in this way not only it help in absorption, but it also milk the lacteals so that whatever material is absorbed in capillaries and lacteals, that can be pushed into, or you can say flushed into drainage of vascular system. Am I clear? But muscularis mucosae don't play any major role in major mixing movement, and they don't play any major role in peristaltic movement, right? Another concept which is very important to understand, that usually it takes 3 hours to 5 hours for the chyme, right, or contents of the small gut to move from the duodenum and jejunum up to the ileocecal valve, right? It takes about 3 to 5 hours, right, to move the contents of small intestine from duodenum through jejunum, ileum up to ileocecal valve. Now the question is that sometimes it becomes fast and other time it becomes slow. What could be the reason? Can you tell me some factor? Sometimes whatever content are here, they will reach there in 2 hours, and sometimes it takes up to 4-5 hours. What could be the reason? Very good. It depends on the nutrients present in the chyme. If in the chyme there are more nutrients, it means we need more time for digestion and absorption. So if chyme is very rich in nutrients, this movement will become slow. But if chyme or the contents of the small intestine are poor in nutrients, we don't need much digestion and absorption, of course this will be faster movement, right? And of course you are very right that the nutrients which can maximum slow down the movement of small intestine are fat. You must be remembering that when fat is reaching to the duodenum, it activates the release of cholecystokinin, right? And cholecystokinin can modulate the small intestinal and gastric movement. Am I clear? Any question up to this? Right. Now we come to that basically small intestinal movement can be divided primarily into two. They are mixing movements, yes, and they are propulsive movement. Propulsive movement. Mixing movements are segmentation movement. Segmentation movement. And propulsive movements are peristalsis. We have already discussed in previous lectures about these two things. I will very briefly just review that segmentation movements are primarily produced by the circular muscles layer in the muscularis externa. And segmentation movement produces, as I explained previously, that if this is small intestine, it is at the movement number 1, right? At moment a little after that, it may divide into multiple segments due to constriction areas produced by the constriction of the circular layer, right? And after that, as I explained in previous video, that after a few seconds, 15 to 20 seconds, these constriction rings which are produced, they get relaxed and smooth muscle contract at other areas. And when it contracts at other area, then naturally what happen, that new constriction ring appear at new sites, right? And in this way, these contents which are present in one area, they will be chopped down into two. So what really happens, that such kind of movements which are called segmental movement, or which are called mixing movement, they repeatedly appear in small intestine, and these movements are produced by which muscles? Circular muscles, and simultaneously in multiple areas of small gut, almost regularly spaced, constriction ring appear, right? And then those areas become relaxed and new set of constriction ring appear, and so forth. And this repeated action mixes the contents of the gastrointestinal system with the secretions, and also repeatedly expose these content with the mucosal wall, is that right? And help in digestion and even absorption, right? By chopping these contents first here and then there, right? Like that. Now, the maximum rate of these movement really depends on what is the basic electrical rhythm of small intestine. As we mentioned previously, that in the duodenum, basic electrical rate or slow waves are produced at the rate of about 12 per minute. And as you move forward in the small gut, movements become slightly slow. So here it may be 9 or 8 slow waves per minute. So the maximum mixing movements, right? The maximum mixing movement per minute depends on what is the underlying inherent slow wave production rate, what is the basic electric rhythm. But usually these segmentation occur 2 to 3 times per minute. They don't occur so much like 9 or 10 or 12 times. Full maximum frequency of segmentational movement is achieved when there is a strong stimulus, like when there is over distension of small intestine, a lot of chyme is coming over there. Do you have any question? Right. Now, this was about the, so we can say that small intestine act by virtue of small segmental movement act as a chopper every 2 to 3 times per minute, right? And now we come to what are another factor. If we give atropine, these movements become very weak. What does it mean? Or almost disappear. It means that without the functional activity of the myenteric plexus, these movements cannot work. So what is the regulation of these movements, segmental movement? Myenteric plexus, cholinergic fibers in the myenteric plexus. Am I clear? Now we come to the peristalsis. Of course, you know what are peristalsis. Peristalsis is the movement which is generated in small intestine. Initially, at one point, a ring is produced, constriction ring is produced. Usually, the constriction ring is produced at the point where there is stimulus for the peristalsis. Stimulus means either there is stimulus from mucosal size, there mucosal area, like there are some chemoreceptors which detect presence of some contents within the lumen of the GIT, or there is some irritation to the mucosa, they can initiate the peristaltic movement, or when there's too much distension and stretch, receptors can also activate the peristaltic movement. And peristaltic movements are primarily controlled by the myenteric plexus. Because they are controlled by myenteric plexus, again, as we mentioned previously, when one part of the gut is stretched out or distended, is that right? Stimulus is there. Then on the ascending part, there are stimulatory action by release of acetylcholine and substance P. And on the descending side, there is inhibition by release of VIP and nitric oxide. So what really happens, that constriction ring, due to stimulation of oral side of the GIT appears, and this constriction ring right, is simultaneously associated with development of relaxation on distal part. So contents of the GIT move aborally, but at new point again they give a stimulus and constriction ring move aborally, and contents again also move aborally, right? So this is how peristalsis in the small intestine move the content. Now these peristalsis again are produced with the maximum they can be produced at the basic electrical rhythm. What was that? Again, it was about 9 to 12 per minute in the duodenum, and it was 8 to 9 per minute in the ileum. What really happens that on the slow waves, spike potentials start appearing, and that start generating the peristalsis. But again, never forget that those for peristalsis we also need enteric nervous system, especially my enteric nervous system. Again, if you atropinize the patient, you give the atropine, peristalsis will die out. Am I clear? Any question here? Right. Now, not only these peristalsis or small intestinal movement are controlled by the nervous system, local nervous system, they are also influenced by the extrinsic autonomic fibers. If there is parasympathetic stimulation, of course, these movements become more intense and more frequent. And if there is stimulation of sympathetic nervous system, the small intestinal movement will become less intense and less frequent. So there's intrinsic neuronal control, which is through the myenteric system, and there's extrinsic neuronal control, which is through the sympathetic and parasympathetic or autonomic control. Then hormonal control is also there for small intestinal movement also. For example, small intestinal movement are increased by gastrin, increased by cholecystokinin, and of course, if you want to remember only one thing, then you remember small intestinal movement are increased by no. If you have to remember one single thing which can stimulate significantly small intestinal movement, motilin. Don't forget it. Motilin for movement. So we are talking about what stimulates the small intestinal movement. Of course, you have acetylcholine, everyone knows. There's no fun in telling. The parasympathetic nervous system motor to small intestine, and rather all the GIT and parasympathetic nervous system fibers do release acetylcholine there. But hormonally, if we talk about gastrin, cholecystokinin, motilin, and 5-hydroxytryptamine, which is also called serotonin. All of these are stimulants for the movement of small intestine, but inhibitors of movement of small intestine is secretin and glucagon, right? Secretin and glucagon. When secretin is produced here, when lot of acidic chyme is coming, that is a moment to not to rush this material very rapidly forward. We want to slow it down and bring enough bicarbonate to neutralize the acid. You get it? So secretin also slows down the small intestinal movement. Secondly, glucagon. That is again logical. When the glucagon is produced, when you have very low glucose level, right? And when glucose level is low, it means GIT is empty. And there's what is the fun to mixing the secretions of the GIT with the secretions of GIT? There's nothing to get out of that. So movement should become intense or slow. So usually with glucagon release, movements in small intestine become slow. Then another thing about the movement of small intestine is gastroileal reflex. When you take a decent meal and stomach becomes stretched, right? Then when stomach becomes stretched or distended, it increases the movement in small intestine. Why? Because new meal has arrived, so let's move the things which are already there, move more distally. Is that right? So this is called which reflex? Gastroileal reflex, right? Or gastroenteric reflex. Now this gastroileal reflex, this is increasing the movement of ileum, right? So that ileum can push the material into cecum, and then jejunal material should come into ileum, and of course then duodenal material should come to jejunum, and if duodenum becomes empty, it's get ready to receive more chyme from the stomach. Am I clear? So gastroileal reflex, of course this reflex not only works through the enteric nervous system, my enteric plexus, but more importantly it works through the ganglions. I told you last time that from the stomach sensation will go through what fibers? They will go to autonomic sensory fibers to the central nervous system, and then from there parasympathetic fibers will come. It can be vagal reflex, or it can be just fibers from here, sensory fibers, number one, going to the brainstem, and then from medulla coming back here, vagal reflex. Or second thing is sensory fiber from here go to sympathetic ganglion, and from there fiber come back. So the three levels of such reflexes, as I mentioned previously, they can be through the enteric nervous system, which is local reflex. They can be through the sympathetic prevertebral ganglion, and they can involve the central nervous system also. When they involve the central nervous system, in this case gastroileal reflex, this will be vagal reflex. Am I clear? No question? Okay, let me tell you. You want to know about sympathetic? Look, here are sensory fibers from stomach which are going through the vagus nerve, and there are also sensory fibers which are going through sympathetic nerves. Right? Usually students have a wrong concept that vagus is only motor, but actually vagus has sensory fibers also. And sympathetic nerves are not only motor, they do have their sensory fibers also. So the sensory fibers from here can go to sympathetic ganglion, prevertebral ganglion, like celiac ganglion, or from GIT they can go to the superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric ganglion. You are understanding? From the ganglion, motor fiber come back to gastrointestinal system, and they can alter the motility. How? Let me tell you. From sympathetic ganglion, the sympathetic fibers come here. If gastroileal reflex is increasing the ileal movement, then sympathetic supply to ileum will be inhibited. When sympathetic supply is inhibited, then inhibition of sympathetic nervous system on GIT is reduced, and GIT become active. Right? You got me now? Is that right? But so what really happens in gastroileal reflex, or any reflex which is through the ganglion, that if you are going to inhibit the target area, then you have to reduce the if you have to increase the ileal movement, then ganglion should inhibit the sympathetic supply here. Am I clear? And secondly, these sympathetic fiber will go up to what? To the medulla through the vagus nerve, and in the medulla they will eventually stimulate the parasympathetic dorsal vagal nucleus, and those fibers which are coming to especially ileum, they are stimulated, and they stimulate the enteric nervous system here, and again movement occur. Am I clear now? Okay, that's good. Now, after having said all these things, the chyme moves through small intestine at the rate of 1 centimeter per minute, approximately. It means in 1 hour, chyme move about 60 centimeters per hour, right, within the small gut. Now, after having said all of these things, we will come to another type of movement which also occur there. We have already discussed the mixing movement. We have already discussed the propulsive movement. Now again we talk about MMC. What are these? Some people call it migratory myoelectric complexes. Migratory myoelectric complexes. And there are other people who term the same thing as migratory motor complexes. So it's up to you what you want to call, right? Migratory motor complexes. Again, in previous lecture, I told you such movement are generated in the stomach also, right? So MMC movement are produced in the stomach also during fasting, and these movements are also produced in gallbladder and small intestine during fasting, right? But the point to remember is MMC movements are not generated in large gut. So they are feature of stomach and small gut. So what MMC movements are doing here? MMC movement or migratory motor complexes, right? They move indigestible material rapidly through the small intestine. Is that right? For example, during fasting, whatever you could digest and absorb, you have done. And now the material which is left, residual material which is left, that should not be left there. Let's push it forward and dump into those areas where it should go to large gut and eventually become fecal matter, right? So what really happens that indigestible or non-digested material by the MMC during the fasting time is rapidly propelled toward the large gut. Is that right? And during the second part of the MMC, secretions from GIT help to dislodge such material from the walls of gastrointestinal system, so we can clear the small gut from such contents. Any question here? No? Now we come to again another movement which can be produced in small gut is peristaltic rush. Right? That is peristaltic rush. Yeah, this is rush hour at gut. Right? Peristaltic rush is produced when there is strong irritation or there is very strong distension in some part of the small intestine. When small intestine really want to relieve itself, even though normally it works well with these movements, mixing propulsive and MMC. But if small intestine is irritated too much or is distended too much and it wants to relieve itself, it will produce very powerful and very rapidly moving, very powerful and very rapidly moving multiple peristalsis, which will rapidly move the contents of small gut into large gut. Is that right? And this classical example of this is in infectious diarrhea. In infectious diarrhea, when the virus here or there are bacterial infections and they're irritating the small gut mucosa, is that right? That may lead to production of peristaltic rush, and these very strong movements, right, they do produce some central abdominal pain also, you see, colicky pain as these movements go down and push the content into large gut, so that they try to relieve themselves from the presence of irritative or overly distending substances. So this is one way how small gut relieves itself, right? Any question here? Okay, this was something about the small gut movement. So can you repeat it? What are the small gut movements? Classically, they are mixing movement like segmentation. Yes. There are a propulsive movement, which are peristalsis. Very good. And then there are, yes, MMC to clean the gut, right, during fasting especially. And then when there is undue irritation to small gut, it may produce peristaltic rush to evacuate its contents rapidly into large gut, right? After discussing small intestinal movement, let's come to the motility in colon and beyond.